Good afternoon, Mr. Gartin.
Yes.
It's good to see you.
Good
do you have
afternoon.
guests with you today?
Yes. Pardon me.
Pardon?
So what?
Do you have guests with you today?
I do. My wife, Tara, and two of my 4 kids, Joshua and Elizabeth. So
Okay.
we're back there in some
Welcome.
moral support today.
Welcome. We're glad you're here today. So if you're settled and ready, you may begin with your opening statements.
Great. Well, thank you, Chairperson Roberts and members of the Commission. It is good to be with you. Every time I go through this, I have a renewed appreciation for the heavy lifting that you do in the course of this work, and the people of Iowa are well served by this. I'm going to keep my personal remarks on the brief side today to allow greater time for question and answer, but I do think it's appropriate to begin our time today with a brief comment with respect to Chief Justice Cady. And the reason why we're here is because of his untimely passing. And he had a big influence on me, and we first had a substantive conversation at a conference that we were both speaking at in Okoboji several years ago. And I had never heard anyone speak like this. For the first time, I heard someone speak about implicit bias and a passionate attention for justice for all. And I was blown away. I was very moved by someone who had such a passion. And he has had an indelible impact on our judiciary. And we cannot go back. So we need someone who is committed to these types of concerns, who carry on the mission of equal justice for all going forward. So it's very humbling. None of these seats have a name on them, but we all have a sense of whose position we're replacing. And so I'm very humbled to be here today. One of the commission members reinforced to me, he said, Tim, there's no guarantees. Just because we sent you up to the governor's office for the Court of Appeals, there's no guarantee that we'll send you up for this. This is an entirely different position. And I think that's absolutely right. I wanted to spend a moment. I won't talk as much about my resume and the things that I think are in common with the Court of Appeals. Obviously, you need someone who has a requisite amount of judicial horsepower to read briefs and research and write thoughtful decisions. But there are some central differences. And in the course of my personal interviews with most of you, I had a chance to visit with you about those. But just briefly, those 3 that I want to talk a little bit about: the importance of civility, judicial administration, and the role of ethics. With respect to civility, it's one of those sort of warm and fuzzy type of qualifications. It's hard to quantify its importance, but I believe it has enormous significance. So what happens with our Supreme Court sets the direction for the entire judiciary, not just for the courts, but also the way in which attorneys deal with each other. One of the commission members shared a frustration that in her area there seemed to be a decline in the civility that lawyers show to each other. Well, I think this kind of leadership starts at the top, and I would love to be a part of a Supreme Court that modeled civility for the rest of the state. Secondly, with respect to administration, the judicial budget is a budget of around $188 million a year. I serve on a city council where we manage a budget of $250 million. There are a lot of important decisions facing this judiciary as we go forward. And you should know that the U.S. Chamber ranks states in terms of their judiciaries. And in 2015, we ranked number 4 in the country. But today, in 2019, our rating dropped from number 4 to number 23. We have to understand why that is. What's happened in our judiciary that we would lose that kind of standing? But I think it's also important that we think about justice for all. African Americans constitute 4% of the population in Iowa, and yet they make up 25% of our incarcerated. That's a very serious and sobering statistic that those who are involved in the judiciary have to take a frontline perspective and try to understand why that is and what role the judiciary can and should have in pressing those numbers down. Those numbers are very similar in the juvenile area as well. And finally, with respect to ethics, I've been focused on ethics education for continuing legal education for about the last 10 years. Attorneys are required to complete 3 hours of continuing legal education every 2 years. And sometimes when you're required to do something, it has the sense that I know it's good for me, but I don't really want to do it. What I call the kale of continuing legal education. And so I've taken it as sort of a mission to set the standard and improve the way in which we do our continuing legal education with respect to ethics. And I think that background would be very important. I provided you with some statistics that are very grim with respect to the number of attorney disciplinary matters that are being reported. And why is that? Well, I think it's very complicated, but one of the things that has to be a component of remediation is having a Supreme Court that is able to reach out and continue the effort of continuing legal education and that focus on ethics. And so with that, I'd like to open it up for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Gartin. We will begin our questions with Mr. Hoyt.
Thank you, and good afternoon. Your resume has a lot of activities, a lot of associations. You are a councilman, you teach. What are those things do you think you could continue to do as a Supreme Court justice, or how would you view your ability to interact with the community in the same manner that you do today if you were to sit as a Supreme Court justice?
Well, thank you very much for that question. My wife has asked me that question as well. So my first priority would be to the 3 million people who call Iowa home. And so I would take a look at what's on my schedule and visit with members of the current court and prior justices. And if anything has to go, it has to go, because this is my first priority. So specifically, if it meant resigning from my role in the city council, I was just reelected for another 4 years. I told the mayor, I said that may be an outcome of this process, and so I've alerted him to that possibility. It's not uncommon for judges to teach on the side, and so I actually had a wonderful experience teaching business law at Iowa State. I worked with 130 sophomores and juniors. You can pray for me. It's 8 o'clock in the morning, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. That's early for them, and so, but all of those things have to take second position to an office like this. Yep, thank you for asking that question.
Thank you.
Ms. Valentine.
Thank you. Given the seat that we're replacing, could you share with us how you think you're most like Chief Justice Cady and how you are least like him?
In terms of most like him, I found that we had some common ground in the areas of heartfelt passions. There are people who don't have a seat at the table that we need to be cognizant of in terms of judicial reform. I think he had tremendous passion for juvenile law and for specialty courts. If you haven't had a chance to watch the condition of the judiciary speech from 2018, it is really remarkable. And I remember when I watched that at the time, I was blown away by that presentation, and well worth watching. But I think that's an area, it's very humbling to be here, as I mentioned, but I would take it as a life mission to carry on that work. In terms of differences, from a lawyering perspective, we come to this from a very different perspective. We're both from 2B, which is sort of interesting, but from the standpoint of lawyering background, I have a transactional background that he didn't have, so a little bit different perspective that way. Thank you for asking that question.
Mr. Sukup.
Good afternoon. What considerations did you weigh differently this time when you applied for the appeals court and now the Supreme Court?
Thank you for that question. They're very different roles. And honestly, in some ways I feel like I'm better suited for the Supreme Court in terms of gift mixes than the Court of Appeals. I would have given 110% effort for the Court of Appeals. But in terms of some of the other aspects of the role of Supreme Court Justice, I think I bring a background in administration that I think would be of great help. The civility, I think, are important features. So there's some other aspects to that service that you don't have with the Court of Appeals. Thanks for asking that. Yep.
Ms. O'Brien.
Thank you. I'm sure you've given thought to why attorney-client grievances are up. And so could you give us your thoughts on that? And then is there something in particular that you feel the Supreme Court could do to address those issues?
How much time do I have?
10 minutes and 16 seconds.
Yeah. So let me try to hit some highlights on this. It's complicated. but I'm going to give you a couple of concrete things. One of them has to be in the issue of ethics education. I think part of it is just attorneys not knowing what they should be doing. And so having a strong CLE program, talking about the rules and the cases, I think has part of it. But I think there's a broader issue that's harder, and that deals with the issue of community. So every time I read a disciplinary case, I go through an exercise. And I ask the question, if that attorney was in a meaningful community of other attorneys, would this still be as likely to have happened? And oftentimes, I think the answer was no. And so, and this can be attorneys even working in a large firm. I'm not talking about just sole practitioners. But I think we need to remember that the rules of ethics need to be applied together. We need each other. And so I think the Supreme Court should definitely have a role of proactively reaching out. Other than that, I think there are tremendous pressures on lawyers right now. And so there are attorneys who make poor decisions based in some ways on the pressures that we experience. Thank you.
Mr. Berger?
No questions.
Ms. Conover?
No questions.
Ms. Pearson?
No questions.
Mr. Gray?
Nothing.
Ms. Law?
No questions.
Mr. Bevel?
Mr. Gartin, you're a transactional lawyer, and you've talked in the past about what that helps or what it brings to an appellate court, someone with that type of experience. Is that even more important with this position?
Thank you for asking that question. I definitely think it is. So we need a full team. We need a diversity of practice areas on this court. Judge Vogel has been a great inspiration and cheerleader of explaining to me of why it's so important that we have people of a diverse background in terms of practice areas. And so the Supreme Court writes the decisions that set the law in Iowa. And so if it's important for the Court of Appeals, I would suggest it's even more important for the Supreme Court. Thank you.
Mrs. Sinclair?
No questions.
Mr. Goodman?
Mr. Gartin, we've had 4 judges apply for this position, and they make the case that we should pick a judge. And what I'd like to hear from you, recognizing that 3 of those judges are trial judges, 1 has been elevated to the appellate court, 2 of those judges have been in private practice before. What do you bring to the Supreme Court from private practice? And you know, we've already got that, or we're going to have that, but perhaps there's a perspective that's fresh without having that judicial experience in the middle. I don't know. I'd like to hear your perspective on why are they wrong, and we shouldn't just pick from the judges that have applied and ignore the 8 lawyers that are on the list.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate the question. I think it's interesting to note that there were a majority of 9 judges this time that applied. I thought that was curious. But I do think there's an important role for having judges on our appellate courts. But I don't think that it's exclusively a requirement. We all bring certain strengths to the table, and I think having some attorneys who have a general practice background would be of enormous value on this court. You have to realize that most lawyers in Iowa are general practice lawyers that practice many times in rural parts of Iowa, and they oftentimes don't see anyone with their practice areas up there. And so you have received letters of support from small-town lawyers all over Iowa that believe that it's important that someone with my background serve in the court. And so, but I would also remind the Commission that I have a background in litigation. I've done a lot of criminal work, juvenile work, that I think also would prepare me for the work that we have. Thank you.
Mr. Horbach?
No questions.
Ms. Stanger?
No questions.
Mr. Bloom?
No questions.
Mr. Spies?
Well, I've been ruminating about this question, and I was going to ask you to give us an example of a situation where you stood up to somebody you disagreed with. But I thought that came across as too harsh, so I guess I'm going to make a more diplomatic question. As a new member of the court, how would you see your interaction with the more experienced, seasoned, experienced members of the court?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I've had that experience before. When I began serving in the capacity of a city council member, there were people that had served there for many years and some that were brand new. And so my goal would be to learn and be teachable. I hope that I have that characteristic. But it's important that over time you develop a sense of your own person. I think it's important to have cases where possible have unanimous decisions, but I also think it's healthy to have some dissenting opinions. Sometimes dissenting opinions are the most interesting part of the cases and might provide direction for the future. So when I talk about the importance of civility, it is not to the exclusion of dissenting opinion. There's value of having different perspectives. And so I hope that I would be the kind of person that would be able to work well with people of a variety of different backgrounds, reach consensus where we can, and make good decisions for the people of Iowa. So does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have a few minutes. Does anyone have an additional question for Mr. Gartin? If not, thank you for being here today.
Thank you
and
very
wish
much.
well.
And I appreciate the personal telephone calls I had with many of you, so I wish you the best in your deliberations. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank